Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 29th of May 2026. The first chart is US dollar index futures. They traded slightly lower this week. They still remain right up high within the range of the previous up bar, this bar. And they're trading right up in the high of that range and around this breakout line, which is also forming the highs of the range. The market's effectively in consolidation mode here, attempting to absorb supply, potentially in preparation for a further push higher. Volume was reduced this week, but it was a shortened trading week with Memorial Day on Monday, and that may account for the reduced volume, at least to some degree. The fact the market continues to trade right up high within the range of the most recent and fairly strong up bar suggests that the buyers remain in control here, and this market may attempt to push higher in response. E-mini S&P, this is S&P 500 index futures. They closed higher this week. Volume was affected by the 4-day trading week. There was no testing for supply this week. The market just pushed higher. You've effectively had an absorption bar here, a test for supply and push higher on that bar, and then an up bar. This market's looking a little stronger than weaker at this point in time. The relatively narrow spreads suggest that there is still some uncertainty in the market, but the sentiment is certainly more positive than negative. At this point, there's still a reasonable chance, possibly around 50-50, that the market will still come back and test this breakout line for strength before pushing higher or attempting to push higher. But it's only a 50-50 chance at this point in time, and that chance will reduce the further away from that breakout line the market moves. The narrow spread and the reduced volume do balance to some extent. However, the narrow spread does suggest there was some supply being drawn out, and that will increase the chance to a small degree that the market may come back and test that breakout line for strength. US Treasury 10-year note futures, and in response to the buying support which emerged last week when the market was threatening to break down here, buying support came in. The high volume suggests that it was pretty good buying support, and in response the market has continued higher and pushed back above this secondary breakdown line in the background. The market's done a pretty good job, and there's a little level just in there that the market's pretty much moved up to this week, and the market may consolidate in response now just in there for a week, or at least for part of the week prior to any further push higher. It could also come back and test the lows of the range for strength if the market was interested in further accumulation at this level. But at this point, the market's gapped up from the previous close, pushed higher, moved above this breakdown line in the background and up to the next level. So that's a pretty good move. Copper price futures. Copper price futures, they appear to want to move higher here. You can see that supply was drawn out on this bar and price came back in response. Supply was drawn out on this bar. The market remained above the highs of the range. There was just a modest test for supply and push higher in response. And there's been a secondary test for supply below the previous bar's close this week. The market did establish a higher high than the previous bar, although the close was adjacent to the previous close. The market's looking stronger than weaker here. It does look like this market does want to go higher. Gold price futures. Gold price futures tested the lows of the range this week for strength. Here, price dipped below the previous bar's low, sort of in a shakeout fashion, before recovering to close just back above that important level. You've effectively had a test for supply and a shakeout, and quite often that equals a breakout, or at least an attempt to break out. So just wait and see if the market does push high here in response, because the market is set up to do so here, or at least attempt to push higher. It does appear that the testing the strength of the lows of the range was successful, with the market dipping lower and recovering pretty successfully to close back above that level and in a good position to attempt to push higher. You've got a mini high of the range here, like an intermediate level, highs of the range there, breakdown line above here. So there is some levels of resistance above the market will need to contend with. However, the first two levels are part of this consolidation, possibly accumulation zone, so it may not be overwhelming resistance, especially as you look down here, volumes haven't been particularly strong, below the average for quite a period of time now. So any sort of intent this market shows will probably move the market higher with relative ease, at least up to this level. Silver price futures pretty much consolidated sideways this week. There was no shakeout sort of bar like there was in the gold price. The market did test the lows of the range for a second time and found enough strength to close back above that and adjacent to the previous bar's close. This market's also well placed to make an attempt to push up to the highs of the range here. And any sort of favourable trading conditions will probably see an attempt to do so. Like crude price futures, this market closed lower this week in response to the potential weakness that emerged last week with this poorly closing bar. The market pulled back with a slightly reduced spread on reduced volume, mostly due to the holiday this week for Memorial Day. When this market's pulled back previously below the important level here, the market has found buying support in response, and the market's closed back towards the important level. So we'll watch to see if that occurs again this time. And this market, to some extent, is forming an apex in here. So we'll just see how that develops over time, and we'll note when the market does break out either above or below that level. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair. And the market traded the inverse to the US dollar to a large degree, as you would expect. And it's traded within this little range here for a second week. Almost the exact inverse to the US dollar, in fact. Volume was reduced, mostly due to the shortened trading week. And this market does look a little stronger just here, and perhaps it will move higher, or at least attempt to, which would suggest that the US dollar may pull back a little further. But we'll just leave that as an open question at this point in time. See what the pound is showing. This is the British pound currency futures, and they've closed slightly higher and back within that same range that it closed within last week. This market's just slightly stronger than the euro again. It was slightly stronger previously until this bar, which was a much deeper pullback than the euro. The euro just pulled back to this level. But the market's recovered to close back in here now, which is roughly where the euro is to a large degree anyway. And I expect this market will probably trade within that zone. And that suggests that the US dollar will probably trade sideways in response. The Japanese yen currency futures are just holding on. That last gasp leveled through there. Very narrow spread, shortened trading week, adjusted volume. It's certainly not looking strong here, and it is holding on and doing a good job at that at this point in time. It probably should have broken down. If the US dollar shows any sort of strength, this market will break down for sure. It's certainly weaker than stronger, but it's holding on. Aussie dollar currency futures, they traded slightly higher this week and more comfortably back within that range again, that range in here. And I expect this market will probably trade in this range again next week, possibly a little lower early in the week with a recovery later in the week, but remaining within that range in the near term. Volume was reduced and holiday affected. Bitcoin futures pulled back again this week, back within this range it's been trading in for some time. It's possibly going to build a terminal shakeout in here, which often happens at the end of a period of consolidation, absorption, or accumulation. You get a little multi-bar shakeout at the end of that period before price attempts to move higher. There was a modest attempt to push higher here before the market did pull back. Volume was reduced, but it was holiday affected this week with the holiday for Memorial Day on Monday. There's certainly not a great deal of weakness being shown in this market. And I'll just wait and see if there's a terminal shakeout here prior to an attempt to push higher, because that would make good sense where the market's traded now for quite a period, especially considering there's expected resistance up here and then again up here if the market gets up there to challenge it. So a pullback and shakeout prior to a push higher would make sense under these circumstances. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. The euro and the pound kind of suggest the market may trade a little lower here, possibly testing for supply early prior to a further push higher. The fact this market is trading right up high in the range of this up bar, this relatively strong up bar, does suggest this market is stronger than weaker. So if there is a pullback at all, it may just be a test for supply prior to an attempt to continue higher. That all remains to be seen at this point in time. There's no doubt this market is absorbing supply at this breakout level, which is the lows of the range above. And it does appear the market's absorbing supply and consolidating at that level in preparation for a potential push higher at some point. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.